Hey, what's up? Today I've got this tiny little bicolor light from Viltrox that's priced right about the same as these two Aputure 100x lights that I have back here. So I thought I'd make a point-by-point comparison of them and see which is the better choice. So let's get into it. Hey, I'm Scott, and if you're new here, thanks for watching. Before we get started, if you want to see how I use these 100x lights in my setup, check the video description for a little behind the scenes video of my talking head setup and also a handful of other YouTubers' setups. Okay, so like I said, this isn't meant to be a demonstration or a tutorial, and I'm not comparing these because they're necessarily identical lights, but they are both bicolor studio lights and almost exactly the same price. So I wanted to see what's up between them. Also, these are the major differences. There are, of course, other small differences like controls, the mount, the materials, etc. But this is what I found to be most significant in no particular order. Now, Viltrox comes with a nice but probably larger than necessary case. Aputure ships in a nice protective box, but it doesn't include a case for storing it or transporting it, and I do think that that is a win for Viltrox. Now, Viltrox has this tiny little mount, and I'm actually not sure what kind of accessories really exist for it besides this included reflector. Aputure, of course, has the larger and more standard Bowens mount, and this in my eyes is a major win for the Aputure. Now, the Viltrox is 60 watts and the Aputure is 100 watts, so in terms of numbers, we should expect to see roughly a one-stop difference in terms of light output, but let's see what that looks like in practical terms. This is using the Aputure 100x at 100% power, 5500K. It's bouncing off of a foam reflector back onto the subject, and the light itself is about a meter from the foam board, and the foam board is about a meter from the subject. I also have the Viltrox light on the background here at 2800K down at 1%. You can see the camera settings up in the top corner for what exposure this gives us. And this is basically the same setup but with the lights switched. So now we have the Viltrox light at 100% as the key light bouncing off that foam board, and the Aputure in the background at 1% on 2800K. That's why the background is much dimmer, because that 1% on the Aputure is much dimmer than 1% on the Viltrox. I kept the camera settings the same, and you can see that the exposure did drop a bit with the Viltrox as a key light, although it's not really a huge difference. Switching up the setup a little bit, instead of reflecting light back onto the subject, I'm shooting it through diffusion. This is just the inside of one of those 5-in-1 pop-up diffusion reflector things. And again, I have the light set at 100%, 5500K, and the light itself is probably between a meter and a half away from the subject, and obviously the diffusion is in between that. And then once again, we've got the other lights on the background. This is the Viltrox as the key light, if you can't tell from the picture on the bottom. It's kind of small, sorry. And then this is with everything switched around. Again, the same settings, same distance. And as you can see, I didn't change my camera settings either. So in this setup, I'm getting pretty much the same exposure as I was in the first setup, bouncing it off the board. In pure numbers, the Aputure puts out about 25,000 lux at 1 meter using that standard reflector that comes with it, and the Viltrox puts out about 11,000. What's interesting though is that at minimum 1% power, the Viltrox is still putting out about 4,500 lux, but the Aputure is down to just 379. So even though the Viltrox should be less powerful, it doesn't dim down as low as you would expect, and the Aputure does. Now, I'd call this a strong win for Aputure, because sometimes with these smaller lights you only need a little kiss of light somewhere, and being able to dim this down as much as possible when you need to is really important, and the Aputure is both brighter at max power and dimmer at minimum power. Easy win. Now, as for other photometrics, I used my Sekonic C800 color meter to test these, and I'll put the results up on screen so you can see the details, but basically they both do pretty well, but I feel like the Aputure does just a little bit better overall. Things like the R9 value, for example, which is important for skin tones, and just the overall CRI are a bit higher. I measured just a little bit of a green tint on the tungsten end for the Viltrox, but nothing major. They're also both pretty accurate in their actual color temperature output compared to the values which are displayed on the LCD, with the Aputure being maybe just a little bit better, but I'll say this is a tie because the differences are for the most part fairly small, and more advanced readings like SSI are still pretty much nearly identical between these two lights. Now we get special effects with both of these. We get 12 in the Viltrox and 8 in the Aputure, but it's not as cut and dry as that. The 12 in the Viltrox includes some completely useless ones in terms of being labeled special effects, and the overall believability of the effects I felt was pretty bad. With Viltrox, you can access and control these special effects from the light itself, though with the Aputure you do have to use the app to get those special effects. Once you do that though, the effects are both more customizable and more believable on the Aputure. So if you plan to actually use these, I would say it's a win for the Aputure because of that. Now speaking of apps, these both do have apps and they're both pretty easy to use. The Viltrox is actually incredibly simple. It works pretty much as easy and simply as a standard remote control would work, but Aputure's is far more in-depth and therefore could be confusing. But it does include custom groups, better control, and it's an app that will only grow stronger when you use it with their more fully featured lights. But I'll call it a tie because for these lights, these bicolor lights, they both work well for what they are. Both of these do also apparently have optional battery power accessories, but I don't have them, so they're meant to run on wall power out of the box, and in that case the cables can be a major thing to consider. Luckily these both have cables that are almost 5 meters long. Very usable without extension cables in most environments. The Viltrox cable has a small DC barrel connector though, and the Aputure has a stronger locking XLR style connection to the light. The actual cable is also broken into two parts with the Aputure leaving the power brick in the middle, but it does have a design that lets you hang it somewhere if you need to relieve tension on that cable connection. The Viltrox cable is a single cable with a larger brick-styled plug. I want to call this a win for Aputure because of the more rugged connection to the light, but I was very happy to see that both cables are at least more than long enough to use in most situations. Now, the last thing to touch on isn't that big of a deal for me, but it could be worth mentioning, is that the Viltrox is smaller and lighter. It's just under a kilogram in weight and about 17 by 9 centimeters in size if we're just measuring the body itself. The Aputure is a little bit larger, 19 by 12 centimeters for the body and just over 1.5 kilograms in weight, but really don't choose either light based on this factor alone. Now, with the prices being nearly identical, $239.99 for the Viltrox and $249 for the Aputure lights, I'd have to recommend the Aputure in most cases. It can do pretty much all of the things that the Viltrox can do, including putting out a dimmer light at low power, and even more. Some of these categories I'd call a tie, but the Viltrox didn't really win in any category except for having a carry case and maybe size. Of course, finding the Aputure light in stock at the moment might be a bit of a challenge, but if you decide to pick up either of these, I don't think you'll be disappointed. But my recommendation does go to the Aputure 100x. So hopefully that helps out for those of you deciding between these, or maybe even just trying to decide between other similar lights with similar points to consider. But if you have any remaining questions or comments, please let me know down below. Otherwise, if you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thank you for watching.